So, hello. I guess we should probably get started. We're on quite a tight schedule. Thank you all very much for choosing to come along to this particular session. My name's Hugh Dellar, and I'm a teacher and teacher trainer based in North London. And along with my co-author, Andrew Walkley, I've written the Outcome series for National Geographic Learning and the Teaching Lexically methodology book for Delta. And what I'm going to be talking about today is colligation. And colligation is quite a strange thing because it first came into the whole sphere of English language teaching over 60 years ago. And for an idea that's been sort of bouncing around the outer fringes of English language teaching for this long, for this many decades, I think it's an idea that's made depressingly few inroads into the mainstream of English language teaching. Can I just ask for a quick show of hands from the audience? How many of you have heard of the idea of colligation? Okay, and how many of those with your hands raised would be confident enough to venture a definition? Yeah, it's always like that. A couple of you, okay. If you were one of those sort of assiduous people who decided to look up what colligation was before you came to this particular session, when you look it up, you might have noticed that it comes from originally a Latin root. And it's a word that's been kicking around in the English language since about the 1600s. And it originally comes from the Latin verb colligare, which comes from col, meaning together, this idea of like collaborating, I guess, and this idea of ligare, which is binding or tying things together. And for a long time, before it started to be used in English language teaching, it was simply used to describe the binding or twisting together of things, particularly with reference to things like basket weaving, this kind of thing, apparently. And it wasn't until 1957 that the idea first sort of transformed over or mutated over into English language teaching contexts. And there was an English linguist called J.R. Firth, and he said that initially colligation is the interrelation of grammatical categories in syntactical structures. It's one of those sentences that you read when you do your Delta or your master's degree, and you read about 5 times and sort of wake up in the middle of the night feeling slightly anxious about whether you've understood it or not. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that the idea started taking off. Under the sort of influence of John Sinclair, the Australian linguist, colligation came much more just simply to mean the grammatical patterns which frequently attach themselves to words. And if it helps you to kind of get a grasp on it, it exists in a kind of relationship with collocation, which has obviously become much more, interwoven into what we think about when we talk about English language teaching. So, as I'm sure you all know, collocation is just words which frequently co-locate or co-occur, words which like to get married. So you've got little kind of adjective-noun collocations like heavy rain, heavy traffic. You've got verb-noun collocations like lose face, gain respect. Colligation, instead of being the words that co-occur with particular words, is the grammatical patterns that frequently occur around particular words. And it's a different way of thinking about grammar that I'm going to kind of go on and talk about and explore and discuss the classroom implications of, because I think it has quite profound classroom implications. Michael Hoey was the guy who really sort of pushed the idea of colligation as a central feature of what we should be thinking about, I think, in English language teaching. Some of you may know Michael Hoey's book from 2005 called Lexical Priming, a new theory of how words and language work. And Hoey basically said, just as when you're learning a word, the word or the item may be primed or may be conditioned to co-occur with other kind of lexical items in terms of collocation, so it may also be primed to occur, or you may be conditioned to expect it to occur with particular kind of grammatical features or grammatical functions. Or alternatively, you may be conditioned or primed to expect it not to occur with particular grammatical features or functions. And this happens all the time in classrooms. A few years ago, I had a Japanese student who came in late to class. And he came in late to class and said, "I'm really sorry I'm late. Something has happened on the underground." Okay? And, you know, instinctively you try and correct this to has happened. And the Japanese student looks at me and said, yeah, but it has been happened by someone. Okay? Very logical way of looking at it. And the issue, actually, it turned out, was that in Japanese, the verb happen, the typical colligations that go with it, the way that this speaker was primed to expect that word to work was with the passive. In lots of languages, that verb's often used in a passive kind of construction, quite logically. In English, for some weird, illogical kind of reason, despite the fact that things have been happened by somebody, it colligates with the active form. So this is just kind of one example of the way in which verbs or nouns or adjectives have particular kinds of grammatical patterns that may seem counterintuitive to students because of their own experience of how those things work in L1. Just to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, if you like, okay? If you take sort of verbs of perception in English, things like hear or see or notice or watch, and you think about the way that these verbs frequently colligate, the way in which they pattern or which they grammar. There's often a kind of object that follows them. This is often followed by an ing clause, and this is then often followed by a kind of adverbial phrase describing time or describing place. So you get things like, God, I heard you coming in last night, 4 o'clock in the morning, conference drinking. I noticed him hanging around outside the house. I heard someone screaming outside. I saw him playing live when I was in Belgrade. And these are all colligational or kind of micro-grammatical features of the way in which these words are often used in English. There's also, I think, particular kinds of features of colligation which make life slightly more complicated, both for users and for teachers of English. And again, it's something that Michael Hoey notes, that basically when you've got words which have more than one meaning, which is, let's face it, pretty much every word in the English language, where this happens, the most common sense of the word will favour particular kinds of grammatical patterns. It will operate with particular kinds of syntactical, grammatical features around it. And in the same way, the less frequent or less common meaning of that particular word will avoid those colligations. It will operate differently grammatically. Where you've got two meanings of a word which are basically equally frequent or equally rare, still, they'll take different kinds of colligational patterns. And where this isn't true, it's because someone's messing with you. It's because someone's basically playing with the language, they're being poetic, they're being creative, they're being funny, they're being ambiguous. And again, just to kind of root it in sort of a more realistic context for you, perhaps. Just take the word cause as a noun, okay? If you look up the word cause in a dictionary, the most common meaning is an event, thing or person that makes something happen. And this meaning of cause has its own particular kind of micro-grammatical features. So it often colligates with the preposition of, there's often a definite article, and then there's often a further noun or a noun phrase. So you get things like, the main causes of these accidents is drivers going too fast. I've got to write an essay on the causes of the First World War, okay? If you then take the third most frequent meaning of cause, it's a kind of, a political cause or a social cause. It's a sort of idea or an organisation that you support because you think it brings some kind of benefit. This meaning of cause has completely different colligational patterns. So here, it's usually found near the ends of sentences, or at the end of sentences. It's usually used with indefinite or with zero articles. So, those of you who come from languages where articles are a huge problem for you or for your learners, so if you're coming from kind of Slavic languages, for example, and you're stressing about articles and you're worried about the 86 different rules that someone once told you there were for article use, it's actually much more complicated than that, I think, because you change the meaning of a word, you change the article that's frequently used with that particular word. And they're also used with a wider range of prepositions. So with this meaning of cause, you get things like, it's hard work, but it's all in a good cause. I'm not very sympathetic to their cause. Give what you can, it's for a worthy cause. And one of the ways in which you're able to decode the meaning of items when you meet them in text or in speech is because of this sort of subconscious understanding that you have of all of the colligational and collocational features connected to that particular item. This helps you to recognise, this meaning of cause must be more to do with aims or organisations than it's to do with something that makes something else happen. Okay? And I think it's important for language teaching because it's not just for words like cause. This is basically true for all words. Different meanings of the same word have different collocations, but also they'll operate in very different ways grammatically. They'll pattern in different ways. They'll colligate in different ways. And I think for teachers and for learners, it requires a kind of shift in mindset because this kind of grammar, and I think it is grammar, it's grammar that exists very much outside of the kind of traditional way in which we've been trained to think about grammar, which is sort of big grammar, king grammar. It's Raymond Murphy's English grammar in use kind of grammar. And if you ask most teachers, what is grammar? The way that we're often conditioned to think about grammar is grammar's to do with tenses, it's to do with modality, it's to do with the passive, it's to do with conditionals. And obviously, all that stuff exists, okay? But there's also a kind of bottom-up way of thinking about grammar, which is thinking about the kind of patterns which connect to individual words that students are trying to use. So when I've got my Japanese student sort of asking me, why don't you say it has been happened? I mean, actually, the only real reason why we don't say it has been happened and instead we say it has happened is because in English, the verb happen doesn't colligate with the passive, it colligates with the active. Obviously, that's not the way I would frame that answer to the student, but that's the reality of why that's wrong. There's no big grammar, logical reason why that should be the case. That's just the case. That's just what that word does in English. You might be thinking, still, so what? What's this got to do with me? What's this got to do with my teaching? I think one of the reasons that this is a real issue is because the way that students often perceive their own sense of progress is to do with grammar. When I do tutorials with students, I have kind of informal chats with students about how they're doing. Time and time again, students' self-reporting and self-perception of the issues they have with English basically come down to something like, I know words. Actually, often what they mean is they know random lists of decontextualized words, which they've memorized with bilingual word lists from translating newspaper articles that are way above level for them. And then what they'll often say is, I know these words, but I need more grammar. I have problems with grammar. I'm sure I can't be the only teacher here who has students who have kind of worked their way through Raymond Murphy's English grammar in use twice. The students who do it first in pencil, then they rub it all out, and then they do it again in pen, and then they buy the new 25th edition copy, and they do that again. And still, when they report to you, they'll tell you, I have problems with my grammar. And I've come to think that actually what this is probably to do with is not the problems to do with manipulating exercises about the present perfect continuous in very tightly controlled contexts. Instead, what it's to do with is the fact that when these students try to use words that they think they know, they struggle to use those words in a kind of accurate or competent way because the words themselves neither collocate nor colligate in the way that they expect them to work because of their own experience from L1. And I think often it's because the students unconsciously will bring their own expectations or primings or conditionings of how they think the language should work from the way the language works in their own first language. And you notice it all the time. So if you think of things like kind of common errors that you hear in class, I teach a lot of Spanish, Italian, French kids. And I'm sure for many of you, these kinds of errors are very, very familiar. I am agree. It is depend on my girlfriend. When you look at these kind of errors, I think, they're not grammar errors in the traditional sense of the word. They're not errors that are going to be rectified by forcing the students to do yet another exercise practicing the present simple. Instead, I think, they're kind of micro-grammatical problems or colligational problems. Because the real issue is, the students obviously understand the word agree, and they obviously understand the word depend. The problem is, when they bring these words from L1 into L2, the grammar that attaches itself to these words differs. And so the students think they know the words agree or depend, but they're not yet aware of the fact that these words operate in this kind of grammatically different environment from one language to another language. And all of our students bring with them their first language primings. For those of you who are basically bilingual teachers teaching in monolingual contexts, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with the way a lot of your students bring over their first language into the second language. The way that they speak Russian in English, or Chinese in English, or Arabic in English, or whatever. And, you know, if your first language primes you to expect things to work in certain kinds of ways, it's logical that you're going to expect the second language to work in the same way. So, for example, if you're a Polish speaker, and I know there's a few Polish speakers in the audience here, if you are, and you're used to saying these kinds of things in your first language, okay, logically, you're going to think that you can say these kinds of things in English. He wants that I study law. It is cold to me. How does she look? Okay? Because that's how those words work in the first language. Those are the grammatical patterns which attach themselves to the first language. And again, the problem here isn't the words. They obviously know the word want and study and law and cold and look and she. The problem is that they're kind of bringing over their expectations and they're not noticing or not yet aware of the gap between the way in which the words grammar in one language and grammar in the next language. And I think one of our kind of core responsibilities as teachers is to raise students' awareness of these kinds of issues, to basically make them aware of the fact that this is exactly what they're doing. They're speaking Polish in English or Spanish in English or whatever they're bringing over. And to kind of try to almost kind of deprogram and reprogram the students, where in a sense what you're then having to do is to make them aware of the gap between L1 and L2. You're trying to break down the conditioning or the priming that they're bringing with them from the first language, and you're trying to make them more aware of how those things actually work in English. And I think often it means not just correcting the surface error. So not just saying, yeah, it's not I'm agree, it's I agree, it's a verb in English. It's then maybe adding a little bit to that, so that you're starting to kind of develop the student's sense of how those words work in a deeper way in the second language. So it might mean that on top of just correcting I'm agree, you also add, you know, I totally agree with you, I half agree I suppose, I half agree I guess, I agree up to a point. It might mean that the student who says things like, it is depend on my girlfriend, you correct the surface error, it depends on my girlfriend, but then you kind of add to their experience of how that word actually works in English by showing some more typical examples connected to what they're trying to say. So it might be things like, I'm not really sure yet, which apparently I can't spell. It depends what my girlfriend wants to do, depends what time she gets home, depends what my girlfriend, it depends whether she's going out that night. In the same way, my Polish student who produces things like, you know, he wants that I study law, you need to kind of correct the basic micro-grammar of that utterance. My dad wants me to study law. And then maybe you need to kind of draw their attention to a couple of extra parallel kind of examples, maybe with some added context, some added language around the language that you're looking at. So you start to look at things like, you know, my dad's quite pushy, he wants me to study business, but I'm not really sure that I want to. It's really cold today, it's freezing, I'm freezing. And again, you know, there's no reason why we do it like that in English rather than the way that It's done from Polish into English. It's just that that's how those words colligate in English. And we need to kind of be making students aware of those gaps, those differences, if you like. I think this way of thinking about correction, this way of thinking about kind of working from what the students are saying, not seeing it as a kind of big grammar problem, but seeing it as a problem to do with the way in which those words pattern in the second language, it's obviously more work for us as teachers. You know, on one level it's obviously easier just to quickly correct the surface error and move on, rather than give the extra priming or the extra kind of input to help students. But I think it's important that we take this extra time, because it kind of raises students' awareness of this gap, to kind of mind the gap activity, if you like. It's making students aware of how the way they think the language should work differs from the way that the language really works. It's giving the students the chance to kind of learn better ways of saying what they were trying to say. It's giving them exposure to slightly more micro-grammatically complex ways of expressing their ideas. And it's giving them exposure to these extra kind of complex, sophisticated ways of expressing their own ideas. And I think classroom material can do some of this, okay? If you're writing classroom material which is rooted in an idea that colligation is important, and I think a lot of course books don't do this. I think a lot of course books basically only tackle meaning. So a lot of the time you get matching single words to pictures, or you get matching words to definitions or to synonyms. That's fine if all you want your students to be able to do is to decode the meaning of those words. If you want your students to have a chance of actually using those words productively in the second language, the meaning is the least of your problems, in a way. In a lot of classes around the world, the meaning's just dealt with very quickly by a translation. Even if the teacher doesn't do the translation, the students will be doing the translation in their heads. And understanding that the meaning is basically the least of the students' issues when it comes to using that language in the second language, using that item in the second language, is a big kind of change of mind shift, I think. And I think classroom material can do some of that. If the classroom material's written in a way that we've tried to do with things like the Outcomes series, if it's written by thinking about the importance of showing students common patterns connected to the words that they're looking at, it helps. But I think, as with many, many, many things in the language classroom, the fundamental thing that makes the biggest difference to students' awareness of colligation is you guys, the teachers, okay? And I think there's 3 or 4 things that teachers can actually do that help. One is, I think, correcting errors in a way that I've been talking about. So thinking about the errors not as big grammar problems, but as problems to do with deploying particular items. So if you have a student who, for example, says something like, drive carefully, it's a really thick fog outside, I think here the issue is, it's not a big grammar problem, it's a problem with deploying the word fog effectively. They just don't know the micro-grammar of fog. There's a temptation initially to kind of correct the basic surface error. So rather than kind of going, drive carefully, it's a really thick fog, you just cross out the And then you start thinking, well, that sounds weird. It's really thick fog. There's really thick fog. Why? Well, that's how that word frequently colligates in English. You might want to mention fog's uncountable, no article needed. You might then want to add, you can also say, it's really foggy outside. And, obviously, teachers often do this all the time. I'm sure many of you are looking at this thinking, yep, I do that. If you do, that's great. I think it's important to realise that the reason it's important to do this kind of thing is because what you're doing here is grammar, but not grammar in the way that students traditionally think about it. I think there are further implications as well, and I think it's really to do with what we do as teachers when we're teaching new vocabulary or new lexical items. And it means always thinking about moving beyond just dealing with the meaning, and thinking instead about colligation, collocation, co-text and the language around the words we're teaching. And I think it means believing as a teacher that examples are at least as important as definitions, because the examples are how we prime students for natural usage. Michael Hoes claimed that the real route towards better proficiency in a foreign language is through sufficient exposure. And I think one of the things that we can do as teachers is to kind of bring our own knowledge of the way in which items are used and show students these in a kind of shortcut by condensing our own experience. So maybe, if you're teaching the word fog, your course book might just have match fog to a picture. What you might then want to do is to add extra examples showing students frequent ways in which fog may pattern, may grammar. So you might look at things like the fog was so thick we couldn't even see 50 feet in front of us. All the flights out of Heathrow have been cancelled because of the fog. You might not be able to come up with these examples yourself, so you might just steal them from a good dictionary. And I think once you've got these, what you're starting to do is to prime the students in their understanding of the microgrammar of the items in question. It also leaves space for the teacher to ask questions about big grammar as well. So if you've got something like all flights out of Heathrow have been cancelled because of the fog, you can also ask things like, what tense is it? Present perfect. Good. Why? From the past to now. Good. Active or passive? Passive. How do you know? Have been cancelled. Good. Who by? Air traffic controllers, someone like that. So even though you're looking at the kind of micro-grammatical features of an individual item, you can also kind of loop back to the big grammatical stuff that students often perceive as grammar. One final thing I think that's really important, particularly if you're a bilingual teacher teaching monolingual students, is the power of two-way translation, where you're basically taking whole phrases and you're getting students to translate the phrases back into L1, into Polish, into Arabic, into Indonesian, whatever language, and then later moving from that back into English. And what you're doing here is you're kind of catching students in that process that they go through of understanding English, decoding English, putting English into L1, but then when they come to speak English, translating directly. And it's a way of catching that and bringing students up short and making them notice this gap and making them slightly more aware of that kind of gap. So just to sort of wrap up really, I think takeaway messages would be, if you're still going into your classrooms believing that big grammar is the core problem that your students face, it's missing the point a little bit. Because as I said, I think most students understand the core meanings of many of the words that they're trying to use when they're expressing themselves. The real problems they have are to do with a lack of exposure to and a lack of awareness of the way in which those words pattern in L2. And I think what it means is we need to be correcting more cleverly. We need to be kind of reformulating the student output more cleverly and layering that output and turning it into useful input. And we need to be teaching vocabulary from this perspective. I'm going to stop because I'm running out of time. If you're interested in this, please have a look at the Teaching Lexically book, which explores these ideas in a lot more kind of detail. And please have a look at the Outcomes series with Nat Geo, where we've tried to implement this stuff in a sort of teacher-friendly, classroom-friendly way. I should also say, if you're interested, we have a website called lexicallab.com, where we discuss a lot of these kinds of issues. We do free material for teachers and students. My email is hugh@lexicallab.com, if you're one of those shy people that's got a question you want to ask later. Please have a look at the Outcome series, and if you're on Facebook, we're there. You may also have seen as you came in, we're running summer school courses in London. If anyone's interested, please do drop us a line. There's a 10% conference discount. Thank you very much for your time and for your patience, and feel free to grab me if anyone's got any questions afterwards. One, go on.
How would you encourage students to apply these
in their self-study time? I mean, in a way, I think the best way you encourage students with this is to lead by example. So when you're dealing with vocabulary in the classroom, you're always trying to draw their attention to the extra language around the items that you're teaching. You're kind of pointing out the extra patterns that are often used with things. And I think then it's encouraging students to learn this stuff. It's encouraging students to do the two-way translation. And it's encouraging students to not just try and learn lists of single words, but to themselves try to find common examples of how those words work, get the examples from dictionaries, get those examples from, asking the teacher, from corpora, anything they can do themselves to learn above single word level and learn beyond the meaning, I think is really useful. I'll be around, so grab me if anyone wants to ask anything else, yeah? Thank you.